Welcome back, friends. Next we're going to be talking about some basic skills in spiritual direction, or what I like to call spiritual direction by the numbers. I love the way Buddhist sutras often like to number everything, and so this is kind of like that. So let's start with the kinds of questions that we ask. There's two main kinds of questions in spiritual direction. The first are clarification questions. And clarification questions, you should be as free with these as you possibly can. Because, you know, as we said, the client is the expert on their spiritual lives. We're not. And, you know, most of what we think we know about the spiritual life of the client is just projection. And so if there's something that we're unsure about, or something that we don't know very much about, ask questions. Ask them to clarify, ask them to explain. Because often in the explanation, they will discover things. So I encourage you to be liberal with your clarification questions. The other kind of question, though, that I want to bring up are process questions. And the thing about process questions are, they're certainly not yes or no questions. They're not really questions about knowable information. They're questions that invite a client to go deeper. And so a process question might be something like, what are some of the ways that you feel disconnected? Or when you feel disconnected, what else is going on in your life? So there aren't easy answers to these questions, but they do really broaden the scope of your conversation, and they invite your client to open up to deeper aspects of what they're sharing about. So, you know, another process question might be, what gets in the way of your spiritual practice? And that might be nothing. And it might be something. And it might be something that isn't immediately apparent. So process questions are questions that linger. Sometimes you sit with them in silence for a while. Sometimes they yield answers later. And the thing about process questions is there's no pressure about them. They arise by themselves. All they really require is curiosity on your part. When you can get yourself out of the way, when you make that connection with the divine, the process questions will arise all by themselves. They will become apparent to you. So you don't have to cast about for them. So there's no need to feel any anxiety about that. They will just arise. And so, you know, I know it's hard to trust that, but please trust it. That's one of the amazing things about this ministry, is that if you're doing it right, you're not doing much. It happens by itself. Mostly we're just privileged to be witness to the sacred things that go on in the spiritual direction session. It's not really about us, and it's not really up to us. That is, of course, if we can get ourselves out of the way. And the easiest way to do that is just to hold that connection to the divine and trust the divine to show up and do the work. Okay, those were the 2 kinds of questions. Next, let's move on to 5 movements in spiritual direction. So, the first movement I want to talk about is a movement toward deeper intimacy, deeper connection. And this is where your client moves into a place of greater communion with the divine. And it might be something that happens in the session, and you will see this a lot. It's a marvelous thing to behold. But it might also be something that you notice that has happened since you saw the client last. There is a glow about them. There is a deeper sense of peace and a sense of being held that perhaps wasn't there the last time. Another movement in spiritual direction that we see is a motion toward interior freedom. Just the sound of that makes you relax, doesn't it? You just, interior freedom. Yeah. I'm not sure I can describe in general objective terms what I mean by that. I suspect that in your heart of hearts you already know what that means. A place where your spirit just relaxes and goes, oh yes, that's right, this is right. And something that has been holding your soul captive is broken, and you are able to breathe free again. That's a lovely thing, and it's a wonderful thing to behold in your client. Another movement you'll notice in spiritual direction is a motion toward inner and outer congruence. This is so important because, who we feel ourselves to be on the inside is not always how we present ourselves or how we are perceived on the outside. And I think often the reason for that is we don't feel safe. We don't feel safe revealing our true self. Maybe sometimes even to ourselves. And so one of the great healing movements in spiritual direction is when we sense that inner that inner identity of who we really are, and that outer identity of who we present as come together, where a person doesn't need to hide anymore. And this might be about any number of things. It could be about sexual identity. It could be about beliefs. It could be about religious identity. It could be about, it's limitless. I mean, there's a number of ways that we hide. And that hiding is always toxic to the soul. And so when we're able to move our inner and outer worlds into alignment, well, that's freedom for the soul. And it is something that you're going to be able to help people with. Another movement is noticing the pressure of the divine or spirit. And I suspect many of you know what I mean by that, because otherwise you wouldn't be sitting in your chair right now. Anyone who has felt a call to ministry has felt that pressure from spirit to move in a certain direction. If there is a part of your life that is out of alignment with your spiritual values, you may have noticed that pressure from spirit to move into alignment with your values. You may have been in relationships that you knew were not healthy for you, and you felt that pressure from spirit for a change. So noticing when spirit is pressing on a client and being able to name that, that's something that we can do for them, because often we're feeling that pressure, but we are resisting letting it come to consciousness. As long as we don't acknowledge it, we don't have to deal with it. And maybe that's true. The thing about pressure is that it builds up until we either have to acknowledge it or we are miserable. So noticing that pressure is something we can do. And speaking of resistance, this is our fifth movement, is noticing when our clients have a resistance to movement. They may be in a really stuck place. They may know when they're out of congruence in their inner and outer worlds, but are resisting moving into congruence. They might be feeling that pressure from spirit, but they're resisting going there. Acknowledging the pressure and making whatever change the pressure is about. And so, resistance is it's in every part of our lives, and it's especially present in our spiritual life, because often what spirit is calling us to scares the willies out of us. Because often it's calling us to a new identity, which is a kind of death and rebirth. It may be calling us to ministry, which involves a lot of sacrifice. It may be calling us into a world of new ideas that are scary. So we can notice when resistance is happening, and we can name it. And just by acknowledging that, yes, I'm resisting this, it can, it's the first step to overcoming that resistance. Okay, let's move on to another 5. 5 ways to open up the spiritual direction conversation. So, a really good way to open it up is, tell me your story. And you only have an hour. People's lives are long. It might take a couple of sessions to get through a person's story. But you don't just want to hear like their entire biography. What you're asking about is the story of their spiritual life. And a lot of times, people take the easy route when answering this question, and they will give you the history of their religious affiliations. And when I have a client who does that, I understand why, because they don't really know me yet, they don't really trust me yet, and I'm asking them to reveal something really tender and personal about themselves. But when they just start giving me a history of affiliations, I usually stop them and say, your affiliations are part of the story and they're important, but they're not the part I really want to hear. I want to hear the love story. I want to hear the story of the ups and downs in your relationship with the divine. And they usually get what I mean when I say that. So, tell me your love story. That's when I hear the good stuff. 2. You might ask your new client, what's your understanding of spiritual direction? In other words, what is it you think we're here to do? Because a lot of times people are not clear on that. And when they're not clear on that, they're not sure what to say, and they're not sure, what to talk about or what not to talk about. And so having them or inviting them to articulate what it is you're here to do, it might save you actually a lot of time and struggle, because you can do a little course correcting very early on, and you can say, I see. Well, my understanding of spiritual direction is this. And you can give your understanding, and usually there's some overlap in their understanding and your understanding, and you can start there. Third is, what is it you would like to accomplish with our time? Or where would you like to be in your spiritual life a year from now? They're kind of the same question. But one's a little short term and one's much longer term. But it really does get to the question of expectations and goals. And knowing what those goals are for your client can be really helpful. If a client seems really frustrated with their spiritual life, I may just start by asking, what's getting in your way spiritually? And if it's nothing, it's, there's always something. So if it's nothing, it means there's some resistance. So, because, no matter how deep we go, there's always deeper we can go. So there's always something that gets in our way. So it's a good way to open up a conversation. Another way is, tell me about your spiritual practice. This is especially useful for clients who have talked about their spiritual practice in their initial conversations with you, or their initial communications. If spiritual practice is part of their reason for contacting you, then, I want to know about it. What's working in your spiritual practice? What isn't working? What are you struggling with? So those are 5 kind of places to start. None of them are better than the others. None of them are mutually exclusive. I imagine within the first couple of sessions will hit on most of them. But you have to start somewhere, and that's a good place. And the other thing you can do, is just keep quiet and let the client lead. And this is often the best strategy when they're coming in with a conflict or a problem or an issue. If that's what's presenting, let's start there. Okay, moving on. 5 things spiritual directors say. I love this. And you might remember a similar section in my book, Starting Spiritual Direction. So one of the things that spiritual directors are famous for saying is, well, how do you feel about that? And I know that's a real therapy question too, but one of the reasons it's a cliche is because it's really, really helpful. Feelings, they're ephemeral. Feelings don't always tell us the truth, but feelings are often a great way in to where a person is at spiritually. Starting with feelings is a great way to start unpacking the situation. So, how do you feel about that? Another thing that spiritual directors say is, where is the divine in that? This is especially good when you're wanting to gently redirect a client. So let's say your client is talking about a relationship that they have with somebody, and you're thinking, this is kind of drifting into therapy territory. A great way to redirect back to safe spiritual direction ground is, where is the divine in your relationship with so-and-so? In other words, where is the divine showing up in that relationship? Or, what do you suspect the divine is up to in that conflict that you are having with this person? The assumption is the divine is always up to something. As I said, the divine is a sneaky cuss. So if you have that assumption and you can share that assumption with your client, then it opens up an immediately kind of broader perspective on the situation, and kind of instantly reorients you to a spiritual perspective on what mere moments ago was sounding an awful lot like just an interpersonal situation. So it's a really, really helpful question, and I recommend it to you. So where is the divine in that? Or what is the divine up to in that? Another thing spiritual directors say is, where is the invitation in this? Or, what is the temptation in this? Now, depending on the situation, I'll ask one before the other, but I always ask the two together. Temptation is kind of a fusty old word that people don't like very much anymore, and it's kind of triggering, but it's such a useful concept, because we are always being tempted to take the easy way out. We're always being tempted to not do the right thing. We're always being tempted to sell ourselves short, or sell somebody else short. So this is temptation isn't something that used to happen to people a long time ago. It just means it's Tuesday and it's now, because it's something that we encounter every single day. There are forces inside us and outside us that seek our undoing. And so noticing when that is happening, when those thoughts we are having are destructive, when that urge that we feel is taking us out of alignment with our spiritual values, when we we want to say something that we know will hurt someone. These are all temptations. But the great thing about temptations is naming them as temptations automatically transform them into something that we can kind of objectify and look at it in different ways, and see much more clearly. And temptations always, always, always come paired with an invitation. So I'm being tempted to do this, but what is the divine inviting me to do instead? So I'm tempted to act out of alignment with my values in this situation, but what is the way that I'm being invited to act in alignment with my values? What's the temptation in this? What's the invitation in this? Those can be some of the most helpful questions you will ask your clients. And so, even though I know temptation is a difficult word, I really recommend that you keep it in your kit bag, because it is going to be very useful. Another question, or another thing that spiritual directors say is, where do you feel that in your body? I think, one of the things about our culture is that it doesn't value the body, but the body is an incredible source of wisdom. Often our mind doesn't have a clue, but our body knows exactly what's up. And so when a person is talking about a situation, or a belief, or about a stuck place, just stopping and saying, where do you feel that in your body? This invites a person out of their head and into their body, and allows them to access the body's wisdom about the situation. And sometimes the location is a body metaphor that is really helpful, and sometimes funny, and sometimes it leads us into a place of deeper meditation, that it might take some unpacking, but the wisdom is there and can be felt intuitively, even if the immediate answer is not apparent. So the last thing that I want to emphasize that spiritual directors often say is, so what happens when you pray about that? Or what happens when you sit mindfully with that? Depending on a person's spiritual practice, of course. So I can't tell you how many times I have gone to spiritual direction and have been talking about a situation in my life, and my director just stops me cold with, and what happens when you pray about that? Because 9 times out of 10, I had not prayed about it. And I feel like Homer Simpson just saying, "Go!" Because, I mean, that's the first place we should take it, is into prayer or into meditation, right? Because the divine may very well have wisdom for us around this situation or this thing. And taking it into prayer or into meditation always changes the relationship with the thing. It moves it into new perspective. It opens us up to new realms of insight about it. And it's, you know, it's also another gentle way of redirecting back to, you know, the spiritual realm. So, you know, 9 times out of 10, your client will say, "Oh, I haven't prayed about that." And just say, "Okay, well, you know, go home and pray about that or meditate about that, and let me know what happens." It is invariably the case that their relationship with the thing shifts. That, you know, something does indeed happen. But it's also kind of training your client to be more spiritually self-sufficient too. It's like, why didn't it occur to them to take it into prayer or meditation? And so you're reminding them that everything in our life can be brought into prayer. Everything in our life can be brought into mindfulness. And just by inviting them to do that over and over and over, so that becomes their first impulse when they encounter anything, really, is going to be a tremendous help to your client. And I guarantee you will also feel kind of proud when you say, "And what happens when you pray about that?" And your client has an answer for that because they have.